So I began this research in 2002 at the Indiana University School of Journalism as a graduate student with another grad student at the time, Spring-Serenity Duvall, who is the co-author of this book. And what we were noticing during this time period, this was in 2002, was a media focus, really pervasive coverage of a string of high-profile abduction cases. There were actually only 3 abduction cases during this time period, but the media conversation around these cases was nothing like we'd seen before. And what we noticed as we looked deeper is that these cases met certain prerequisites. So in every case, it was a young Caucasian girl that went missing from a fairly affluent or a middle-class neighborhood in the middle of the night, typically from her bedroom or from her home, abducted by a male stranger. So there was a pattern that emerged in the news coverage surrounding these cases. As we looked deeper, we realized that actually child abductions was at an all-time low during that time period, that we saw such heightened media coverage. And so as critical cultural scholars, we began to ask questions and investigate why that might be. So in the book, we examine hundreds of news stories. We look at television news, both video and transcript. We look at major mainstream newspaper coverage, news magazines, as well as web stories. And we examine how race and class and gender were used to tell the story of child kidnappings in U.S. news. We really unpack the reason why certain cases seem to rise to the level of national prominence, while other abduction cases went largely uncovered. So historians of childhood have argued for decades that stories about child kidnapping are about much more than just these particular cases. It's much more than just crime news, in other words, that these stories are emblematic of larger tensions and changes and shifts that are happening in the culture. So in our book, we argue that in the 2000s, rather than focusing on boy victims, for example, which was a major component of coverage in the 1970s and 1980s, we argue that in the 2000s, news organizations focused primarily on young, white, very telegenic young girls, and begin to question why these faces became symbolic of innocence. We examined how these particular stories, these particular cases, and really the faces of these young girl victims came to symbolize much more. So, for example, many cultural theorists have argued that post 9/11, so after the 9/11 attacks on the United States, we began to see journalistic narratives around innocence and culpability and themes of nationalism, and we saw those same themes actually occur in stories about missing children. And so we conclude that we can look at cases of missing children in the news as telling larger tales about the major shifts and tensions that are happening in the culture at large. We find this research to be really important on a number of levels. First of all, as just individuals in this community, as part of this culture, we need to be concerned about missing children, and certainly in particular as theorists, this book contributes to an overall body of research that's been done on crime news, and how crime news is about much more than just the crimes themselves, but how with journalistic narratives, the production of these moral panics can actually have an impact on the culture at large. We also find this research to be important for journalists, for reporters and editors that are covering these stories. The fact of the matter is that news coverage is directly linked in many ways to these real-world implications as to whether or not the child is actually found or recovered, and how quickly that process happens. So there's a real synergy here between media and police. And really what this research hopes to do is to showcase the extent to which some of these cases remain invisible in mainstream media coverage, which has a real-world impact on the lack of coverage, and quite frankly, a child's life may be at stake.